it's actually a Matilda. You won't think so. You think the Matilda was the tank we used in the desert. But before that had been built, this little two-man thing was the Matilda. It was the original, not waltzing Matilda in those days, the original Matilda, if you like. It's powered by a Ford V8 engine again. It's terribly uncomfortable. It has a one-man turret armed only with a machine gun, and yet those tanks fought in France in 1940 with 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments, and were the mainstay of the fighting force at Arras, which knocked the Germans back briefly before they charged on and won the whole campaign. They're hideous little tanks, to be honest, and probably better as a mobile machine gun post than a tank, but they were used as tanks. We only used them the once. We lost most of them in France, and I think we're probably quite happy to do so. You couldn't really use them for anything else. Quite interesting vehicle to say.
The Matilda one's really the first what we would call an infantry tank. It was designed very specifically to help the infantry forward across what was thought of going to be like a First World War battlefield. They called it the shelled area. So it had thick armour, so it could withstand blasts from shells, machine gun to help suppress the enemy position and let the infantry get onto the target. That was the idea behind it. It was in response to a War Office requirement in 1935 and designed by Sir John Carden of Vickers. And it cost him £15,000 to design the tank, and each one that was produced afterwards was £5,000 each. And they only made just over 100 or so of them. And we're very lucky here at the museum because we've just got about the 3 remaining ones left. There's this particular vehicle that we drive. It came off a range, it's got some holes in the side. It's actually got a replacement Rover engine in the back, not the original engine. And so we can demonstrate it. We've got another example in much better order inside the museum, and some of you may have seen we've got a range wreck full of holes that we like to line the road as you come in. It's on the side there. So one of those vehicles, short service life, but was very important at its time.
And going round the other way, just to make a change, is the M3 or M3A1. It's a tank that we called the General Stuart after the Confederate General Jeb Stuart. The Americans knew it as the light tank M3, but they adopted the names we picked up from them as well. It was actually, when it first went out to join the British Army in the desert, it was deemed to be a cruiser tank. It had the same armament as the British cruiser, but it was really more of a reconnaissance vehicle, quite fast in its day, but they ran a lot of the without the turrets in the end. We found they were probably better as a written vehicle without the turret on, because the 37mm gun was not really rapidly outclassed and not that effective. It's powered by a 7-cylinder Wright radial aircraft engine in the back. It's an air-cooled engine upright in the back of the tank, and like most American tanks in those days, it drives to a forward gearbox and then into front-mounted drive sprockets, which is something you won't find on any British tank except our very lightest ones.
One thing about the American tanks arriving in the desert, we often look at history, we tend to kaleidoscope it and look at the end of the war, when obviously a tank like this was no match for the larger German tanks. When they first arrived though, British soldiers called this tank a honey because it was so lovely, so reliable, and that's something to remember. These were considered, the American tanks, fantastically good, reliable, easy to work on compared to so many of our own tanks which had chronic unreliability problems early in the war.
Right, now the next tank coming on is a Valentine, one of the British tanks from the middle part of the Second World War. Again, it's an infantry tank. It was classified as the Infantry Tank Mark III, but because it was very versatile, they tended to use them as much as cruisers as anything else. It's fitted with a suspension invented by Sir John Carden, which he called his Bright Idea suspension. It's powered by a General Motors diesel in the back. This is a later version with a larger, looks like a 57mm gun, and Normally they had a two-man turret and a very uncomfortable one-man driver's position. But they were remarkable tanks. They went on for years. We supplied them to the Russians. A number were built in Canada. They were supplied to New Zealand and other armies, and were quite popular in their day. But they tended to get outclassed later on, without the ground clearance that they needed to give them a good cross-country performance, which their later cousins did a lot better. But it's a nice low-profile tank, and was probably the most reliable of all the British tanks of the Second World War.
This particular version going around, this is a later in the production run, a Mark 9, and this had the 6-pounder or 57mm gun fitted to it. They had a problem earlier in the war, 2-pounder gun. They weren't too sure how many guys they should have in the turret, because so often if you make the commander of a tank part of the gun crew, in other words, whether he's having to load or aim the gun, he's overworked. His role really in the turret should be looking out for where the enemy are, telling the driver the best way forward, and so 3-man turrets were considered ideal rather than a 2-man turret. But this was a tank that we often overlook, the Valentine, but that was quarter of British tank production in World War II with Valentines. And as David mentioned, an awful lot was sent also. Some were made in Canada, some were made in Britain. Over 2,000 of them were sent to the Russians to help them on the Eastern Front.
And talking of the Russians, here comes their key tank of the Second World War, the T-34. This is a T-34-85. It's got the slightly larger turret and the 85mm gun. The original version had a 2-man turret and a 76mm gun, but with the 85mm you've got 3 men in the turret. A characteristic of the tank is the sloped armour, both at the front and the sides, which the Russians always claim to have invented, but it's been around a while before that. The tank has a version of Christie's suspension, meaning that each row wheel's independently sprung on coil springs, but with large flat plate tracks to deal with the snow. Powered by a V12 diesel engine in the back and proved to be quite reliable. It was built in huge numbers because, as David said earlier, the Russians regarded tanks as expendable and available in huge numbers for that reason. It is actually, if you get up close, pretty crudely made as well, but that never worried the Russians. They weren't trying to win prizes for beauty. They wanted loads of fighting machines, and that was the best way of doing it.
One of the things that's often pointed out is that crudity of Russian vehicles, but famously when a T-34 was captured outside Moscow, taken to Berlin, and Albert Speer, the German armaments minister, got all the German tank designers to look closely at the T-34. Initially they were hugely scathing because it seemed so crudely engineered, but there was a time when the Russians actually drew up plans to or the Germans actually drew up plans to copy the T-34 because they realised it had such good qualities, such as the sloped armour, good wide tracks, ideal on the Russian front where you've got mud, snow, very few metalled roads. But in the end, being the Germans, they thought they could go one better, and they end up building the Panther tank as really a response. Don't forget, often a myth, it wasn't the T-34 that led to the Tiger being built. That, amazingly, was because the Tiger bumped into, or sorry, not the Tiger, but the Germans bumped into the British Matilda tanks in France in 1940 with that thick armour we just saw in the earlier Matilda. That caused Hitler to initiate the Tiger programme, not actually this whopping great Russian tank, the T-34. Germans were very unaware of the extent and the numbers of Russian tank development before they invaded in 1941. And so the T-34 was a bit of a shock for them, even though, of course, the Germans and the Russians had actually cooperated in tank design earlier because they were both pariah countries in Europe after the First World War. Germany in the Weimar period, Russia after the revolution, no one in the West wanted to talk to them. So they actually got together and did tank development together and training at a place called Kazan in Russia. But they fell out again when Hitler came to power, and of course this tank became an enormous shock to them when they invaded in the summer of 1941. This particular one, marked up in Polish colours, as you can see, still drives that very distinctive noise as it's driving. That's actually a plate on the hull that knocks the pins that are holding the tracks together back into place every time they come around. So it gives it a very distinctive tap, tap, tap noise as it drives along. Now, as the T-34 drives off, we're going to be bringing on almost the American equivalent in the Second World War, the famous Sherman tanks. And again, it's part of our mantra here. We often say lots of rude things are said about the Sherman tank, but in essence, it was a brilliant design by the Americans because they could make it in such huge numbers. And we've got 3 different variants about to come on. Because they made so many of them, they couldn't quite make the same number of engines, and they had different factories with different capabilities. So sometimes you get cast hulls, sometimes welded hulled vehicles. Later in the war they put a bigger gun on, such as the 76mm gun that's on this particular variant of Sherman, and they up-armour them, and they make just under 50,000 of them. And for the American war plan, it worked. They threw their engineering ability and money at the problem when the war came along, and don't forget, they were on the winning side. Now, this particular Sherman going around, this is the Tank Museum Sherman, and this is the one that was used recently as the Fury in the war movie, The Fury. And we've left all the kit on it, so it looks like it's kitted out as it was in the film.
It's worth pointing out, actually, that the Sherman in question, it's a 76mm gun Sherman with a long gun in it and the enlarged turret, but it's actually powered by a pair of General Motors diesels. Now, the US Army during the Second World War would have nothing to do with diesel engines at all. They decided on petrol, and petrol it would be. So the diesel engines were only used by the US Marine Corps in the Pacific. So to that sense, it's actually the wrong tank for the film, but it was all that was available. And I think the film was about the crew and their survival in the tank more than anything else. And that really showed up well. Brad Pitt was the star. So that's going round now. You'll also notice it has a slightly different suspension. That came on later, involving horizontal coil springs to produce what the Americans call an Easy 8 suspension, whereas the early ones had vertical volute springs.
Now, with any luck, we'll be seeing these 3 Shermans later on in the afternoon because they'll be taking part in our battle. As with all our Sherman tanks, as with all our tanks here, sorry, just looking there, we always say to the drivers of the vehicles, hot day today, if the temperature gauge goes too high, we ask them to cut off. We don't want to put anything at risk as they're driving around, so I'm not too sure there. He might be having a warm engine, but he's certainly keeping the speed down at the moment. Crash gearbox, driving all these vehicles, it's quite fun trying to get them into gear. But that particular Sherman's been a regular runner here at the museum for many years, and what we like to do with this one, we're going to try and get another Sherman going over sometime in the future with a 75mm gun Sherman, and that'll be an example what we're going to be seeing in a moment. 75mm, 76mm, doesn't sound much in it. The 76mm, 1mm wider at the hole at the end of the barrel, but it's a higher velocity gun. If you see the rounds next to each other, there's a larger brass charge with propellant in to fire those rounds out with a tremendous amount of force behind them compared to the earlier medium velocity 75mm gun that was fitted to the earlier model Sherman tanks.
There are other differences as well. If you look at the front of the new Sherman, the one we put on, it's a much more sloped, much broader sloped front. On the earlier Shermans, like the one coming on now, that's narrower. And that's quite typical of these early and older tanks when you see them. This is also an M4A2, powered by the diesel engines, but with the earlier type of suspension, 75mm gun in a conventional turret. It's an all-welded construction, which the Americans were very keen on and did very well. And like all the other tanks, eminently reliable. And the diesels will go on forever. In fact, they're absolutely amazing units. But they were used by the British Army quite a lot in the Western Desert and in Italy and so on, but never by the American Army if they could help it. They had an abhorrence of the diesel engine completely and went to the petrol engine versions only. They had a version with the Ford V8 in it, which was probably the most reliable of all. The worst of them is always said to be the version of the M4A4, which has what they call a multi-bank Chrysler engine. Actually 5 6-cylinder Chrysler engines all clustered around the central drive shaft or sort of central crankcase. And that engine, for some reason, the British liked. It's the most awful thing you can possibly imagine. Had to be taken out, you had to lift the whole engine out.